"Sir, if you are going to panic, at least do it quietly." The words cut through the shaking cabin, just as the Boeing 777 dropped hard enough to send gasps ripping through the rows of passengers. Plastic cups bounced across tray tables. Oxygen masks trembled inside their overhead compartments without fully deploying. Somewhere near the rear galley, a child started crying. Flight attendants moved fast beneath the flickering amber cabin lights, their smiles stretched thin over rising fear. 30,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, Flight 482 had stopped feeling like a normal overnight route to New York. It felt trapped between the storm clouds outside and the growing panic inside. Claire Donovan gripped the edge of a service cart hard enough for her knuckles to pale. She had worked international flights for 11 years, and she knew the difference between rough air and something worse. The aircraft wasn't just shaking. It was struggling. She could feel it in the uneven vibration beneath her shoes, in the strange pulse coming through the cabin floor every few seconds, like the jet itself was trying to catch its breath. Another violent tremor rolled through the fuselage. A businessman in first class cursed loudly as whiskey splashed across his sleeve. "What the hell is happening up there?" someone shouted. Claire ignored them. Her attention locked instead onto the older man seated calmly in 16A beside the window. While everyone else clutched armrests or stared at the ceiling with wide, terrified eyes, he sat perfectly still. One hand rested on the armrest. The other lay folded over an old brown leather carry-on worn soft with age. He looked out into the blackness beyond the glass as if the storm belonged to him. Nathaniel Reed was 83 years old. His silver-gray coat was neat but outdated, the cuffs slightly frayed. Deep lines crossed his dark face like old rivers carved through stone. The overhead light caught the faint reflection in his eyes, calm and steady while the cabin shook around him. Claire had noticed him before takeoff in Dallas. Quiet, traveling alone, no checked baggage. One of those older passengers who asked too many questions about turbulence and routes and fuel delays. The kind younger crews joked about after landing. But now there was something about him she didn't like. Not because he was loud, because he wasn't. The plane lurched again, harder this time. A few overhead bins snapped open. A woman screamed. Claire steadied herself against the galley wall as her intercom crackled alive with static. "Cabin crew, secure immediately," the captain's voice ordered, clipped and tense. Possible systems malfunction. Systems malfunction. Not turbulence. Not weather. Claire felt her stomach tighten. Across the aisle, Nathaniel slowly lifted his eyes toward the cockpit door. His expression changed almost invisibly, but enough for Claire to notice. Recognition. Not fear. Recognition. Then came the sound. A faint metallic whine buried underneath the engines. Most passengers never would have noticed it over the storm and rattling cabin panels. Nathaniel did. His head tilted slightly. Listening. "That's not supposed to sound like that," he murmured. Claire turned sharply. "Excuse me." Nathaniel looked toward her calmly. "Your bleed air pressure's dropping." Claire stared at him for half a second before scoffing under her breath. "Sir, please remain seated." Another chime echoed overhead. Then the cabin lights dimmed for one long, unsettling second before returning weaker than before. This time, even the businessman stopped complaining. The fear spreading through the aircraft had become something heavier now. Quieter. The kind people felt before admitting to themselves they might actually be in danger. Nathaniel Reed simply looked back out the window into the darkness above the clouds while the distant growl of the struggling engines rolled through the cabin like approaching thunder. The smell of burnt coffee drifted through the dim cabin as Flight 482 pushed deeper into the storm over the Atlantic. Rain streaked violently across the windows now, illuminated by occasional flashes of distant lightning that turned the clouds outside into jagged mountains of white and black. Claire Donovan moved quickly down the aisle checking seat belts with forced composure, but the strain was beginning to crack through. Her professional smile. Passengers sensed it. Fear spread fastest when the crew stopped pretending everything was normal. Somewhere near row 20, a man whispered a prayer under his breath. Across the cabin, Nathaniel Reed remained motionless in seat 16A, his attention fixed not on the frightened passengers, but on the rhythm beneath the aircraft itself. He listened to the jet the way older sailors listened to storms at sea. Every vibration meant something. Every change carried a warning. Another uneven tremor rolled through the fuselage. This one lasted longer. The overhead lights dimmed again, and several passengers gasped as the engines briefly dropped into an unsettling low growl before stabilizing. Claire caught herself gripping the nearest headrest. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain announced over the intercom, his voice tighter now, "we are experiencing a technical issue and some unexpected turbulence. Please remain seated with your seat belts fastened." Technical issue. The words hung in the stale cabin air heavier than turbulence ever could. A tall man in an expensive Navy blazer near first class stood halfway from his seat despite the shaking aircraft. Richard Cole, 50 years old. Wall Street confidence carved into every sharp movement. "Technical issue," he snapped loudly. "What exactly does that mean?" Claire approached immediately. "Sir, I need you seated." "I paid $12,000 for this seat," Richard shot back. "I deserve an actual explanation." The passengers nearby watched nervously. Richard glanced toward Nathaniel sitting quietly by the window and shook his head with visible irritation. "And why is that guy acting like he knows something the rest of us do not?" Claire lowered her voice carefully. "Sir, please." Richard was not done. Fear had sharpened into anger now. "People like him always do this," he muttered, loud enough for nearby rows to hear. "Old men who think they are experts because they watched some documentary 40 years ago." Claire glanced briefly toward Nathaniel. He gave no reaction, no anger, no embarrassment. He simply watched the storm outside while the aircraft rattled around him. That calm unsettled her, more than panic would have. Then the intercom crackled violently with a burst of static so sharp several passengers jumped. A flight attendant near the forward galley hurried toward Claire, pale-faced. "The cockpit says one of the pressure systems is fluctuating again," she whispered. "They cannot stabilize cabin airflow." Claire looked back instinctively toward Nathaniel. He was already looking directly at her now. "You are losing pressure through the secondary bleed system," he said quietly. "The left engine is compensating harder every minute." Claire stared at him. "Sir, with all respect, you need to stop speculating." Nathaniel tilted his head slightly as another faint metallic whine echoed through the cabin floor. "That sound was not there 20 minutes ago," he replied calmly. "Now it is cycling every 12 seconds. Your pilots hear it too." Claire opened her mouth to answer when the aircraft suddenly dipped hard enough to send screams across the cabin. Luggage shifted violently in overhead bins. A baby cried somewhere near the rear rows. Richard Cole grabbed his armrest with both hands, his face losing color instantly. In the middle of the chaos, Nathaniel Reed remained perfectly still. Then, for the first time since takeoff, he unbuckled his seat belt slowly and stood. The motion alone changed the atmosphere around him. Not dramatic, not rushed, controlled, deliberate, like a man who had stood inside danger before and learned long ago that panic only made people die faster. Claire stepped directly into the aisle to block him. "Sir, sit down immediately." Nathaniel met her eyes with calm that felt almost unnaturally steady beneath the flashing cabin lights. "Your captain needs help," he said softly, "and he is running out of time." For a moment, nobody moved. The storm hammered against the aircraft's skin with a deep hollow roar while the cabin lights flickered weakly overhead like exhausted candles. Claire Donovan stood frozen in the aisle, blocking Nathaniel Reed with one hand gripping the seat beside her. Around them, frightened passengers watched the old man standing calmly in the shaking cabin as if he had simply risen from church instead of inside a damaged aircraft 30,000 feet above the Atlantic. Richard Cole let out a disbelieving laugh that sounded thinner than before. "Oh, this is unbelievable," he snapped. "Now we are taking advice from him." Nathaniel ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed toward the cockpit door. Another vibration rolled through the floor beneath their feet. Longer this time. Uneven. The subtle pulsing hum from the engines shifted pitch again, followed by a faint whining sound hidden deep inside the aircraft walls. Nathaniel's eyes narrowed slightly. "Listening. Counting. Measuring. Your left pack is compensating beyond normal limits," he said quietly. "If the pressure balance collapses completely, the cockpit is going to lose visibility from condensation buildup." Claire blinked. "How would you even know that?" Nathaniel finally looked at her directly. His face remained calm, but there was something heavy behind his eyes now. Experience. The kind built over decades most people could never imagine. "Because that sound means the bypass valve is sticking every few seconds," he answered softly. And your pilots are trying to solve the wrong problem. Before Claire could respond, the cockpit door suddenly opened. A younger flight attendant stepped out fast, fear written openly across her face now. Claire, she whispered urgently. Captain Mercer needs another set of eyes up there. Navigation keeps dropping offline. Her gaze shifted toward Nathaniel standing in the aisle. Who is he? Claire hesitated. She did not know anymore. Another violent tremor shook the aircraft. A few passengers cried out. Somewhere in the back, luggage slammed hard against an overhead compartment. Nathaniel steadied himself with one hand against the seat, without even looking. The motion was instinctive, controlled, like balance itself had been trained into him long ago. Captain Mercer does not need another flight attendant, Nathaniel said calmly. He needs somebody who recognizes that engine cycle before the pressure manifold cooks itself. The younger attendant stared at him. Claire felt irritation rise again, partly because the old man sounded so certain, and partly because some part of her feared he might actually be right. Richard Cole scoffed loudly from his seat. This is insane. You are really going to let some random old man walk into the cockpit? Nathaniel glanced toward him briefly. No, he replied evenly. I am going to keep your airplane in the sky. The words landed with terrifying calm. No arrogance. No performance. Just certainty. The kind of certainty that made the people around him suddenly quieter. Up front, another warning chime echoed through the aircraft, followed by a muffled voice from behind the cockpit door. Claire could hear tension bleeding through every syllable now. Cabin pressure fluctuation confirmed. Nathaniel closed his eyes for 2 seconds as if hearing something nobody else could. Then he opened them again. There, he murmured. That harmonic shift just got worse. Claire frowned. Harmonic what? The airflow frequency changed, Nathaniel answered. Your engine bleed is unstable now. If ice builds inside the pressure regulator line, this aircraft is going to start chasing false readings. The younger attendant swallowed hard. Captain Mercer said the instruments are already conflicting. Nathaniel nodded once. Not surprised. Outside the windows, lightning flashed across the clouds in sharp, white veins. For half a second, the entire cabin glowed silver. Nathaniel Reed stood motionless beneath the flickering lights, his weathered face calm, while panic spread through everyone around him. Claire realized then what unsettled her most about him. He did not sound like a passenger guessing. He sounded like a man remembering. The cockpit door opened halfway with a sharp metallic click, and the smell of overheated electronics drifted faintly into the cabin. Claire Donovan could hear voices inside now, low and urgent beneath the constant roar of wind against the fuselage. Captain Daniel Mercer sounded controlled, but only barely. Every pilot learned how to hide fear in their voice. The problem was that experienced crews could hear it anyway. Nathaniel Reed stepped forward one slow pace as another warning tone echoed from inside the flight deck. Claire immediately moved to stop him again. Sir, you cannot go in there. Nathaniel stopped without argument. His calm unsettled her even more now because it never cracked. Not once. Not during the turbulence. Not during the system failures. Not even when frightened passengers began openly whispering about emergency landings and engine fires. He simply looked toward the cockpit like a man hearing an old familiar song. Your captain is trying to isolate an airflow fault through the environmental controls, Nathaniel said quietly. But the problem is upstream. Claire folded her arms tightly. You keep talking like you know this aircraft. Nathaniel glanced briefly toward the cockpit windows ahead. I know pressure systems, he answered. And I know what happens when pilots trust clean instrument readings during a dirty mechanical failure. Before Claire could respond, the younger flight attendant leaned back through the cockpit doorway again. Her face had gone pale beneath the dim cabin lights. Captain Mercer wants to know exactly what he said about the bleed air system. Claire hesitated only a second before pointing toward Nathaniel with visible reluctance. The younger attendant looked confused. Him. Nathaniel nodded once. Tell your captain the secondary pressure regulator is probably icing intermittently. The system keeps resetting because the sensor thinks the fault clears itself every cycle. The attendant stared at him for half a heartbeat, then disappeared back inside the cockpit. Richard Cole let out another disbelieving laugh from his seat near first class, but there was less confidence behind it now. This is absurd, he muttered loudly. You are all listening to some old man because he sounds dramatic. Nathaniel ignored him completely. Outside the windows, lightning flashed again across the cloud tops, bathing the cabin in cold white light. For an instant, every frightened face looked carved from ice. Then darkness returned. The aircraft shuddered hard enough to make the overhead bins rattle violently. A woman near row 18 started crying softly. Somewhere farther back, someone whispered that they should be descending already. Nathaniel's gaze shifted upward slightly, as if tracking something invisible through the aircraft structure itself. There, he murmured under his breath. Claire frowned. What now? The cycle spacing changed again. Nathaniel listened carefully for another few seconds. Your left engine is overcompensating for unstable airflow. If the cockpit does not manually isolate the pressure transfer valve soon, the system is going to start feeding false temperature data into the avionics cooling loop. Claire stared at him in silence. Most passengers would not even understand those words. Nathaniel spoke them without hesitation, without thinking, like memory instead of theory. The cockpit door opened fully this time. Captain Mercer himself stepped partially into the aisle. Mid-40s. Former Air Force before commercial aviation. Calm under pressure. Until now. His uniform collar was damp with sweat despite the cold cabin air. He looked directly at Nathaniel Reed with narrowed eyes, studying him carefully. Sir, Mercer said evenly, my first officer tells me you identified a pressure imbalance before our system alerts confirmed it. Nathaniel nodded once. Yes. How? Mercer asked. Nathaniel glanced toward the vibrating cabin wall beside him. Because your aircraft started singing off-key 20 minutes ago. For the first time since the crisis began, Captain Mercer looked genuinely unsettled. The pilots inside the cockpit had spent the last half hour buried in diagnostics and conflicting warnings. This old man had identified the same failure by listening to the airplane brief. Mercer looked back toward Claire, then toward the frightened passengers. Finally back to Nathaniel Reed. Sir, he said carefully, I need you to come with me. The cockpit smelled faintly of hot circuitry, stale coffee, and tension stretched too thin. Rain hammered across the forward windshield in violent sheets while warning lights glowed amber across the instrument panels like distant fires in the dark. Captain Daniel Mercer barely looked away from his displays as Nathaniel Reed stepped quietly into the cramped flight deck behind him. First Officer Emily Carter turned immediately, disbelief written across her exhausted face. Captain, she whispered under her breath, you brought a passenger in here. Mercer did not answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on the fluctuating pressure readings dancing across the overhead system's display. He identified the regulator imbalance before our diagnostics did, Mercer said finally. Emily stared at Nathaniel again, trying to understand what she was seeing. An 83-year-old black man in a worn gray coat, standing calmly inside a failing cockpit, while modern avionics struggled around him. Nathaniel moved closer to the center console without touching anything. His pale brown eyes drifted slowly across the instruments, not rushed, not overwhelmed. Familiar. Outside the windshield, lightning flashed again, illuminating thick storm clouds rolling endlessly ahead of them. Your manifold temperature spread is too clean, Nathaniel murmured softly. Emily frowned. What? Nathaniel pointed toward one of the pressure indicators. That reading should not be stable if the airflow fault is random, which means your system is correcting false data instead of the actual failure. Mercer exchanged a quick look with Emily. That possibility had not occurred to either of them yet. Nathaniel leaned slightly closer toward the overhead panel as another subtle vibration rolled through the aircraft structure. His expression changed almost invisibly. Recognition. Then came the sound again. A faint metallic oscillation hidden beneath the engine roar. Nathaniel closed his eyes for one brief moment. And suddenly the cockpit vanished. The cold blue glow of modern avionics dissolved into the deep red flicker of emergency lights. The roar of rain became the scream of engines fighting damaged airflow over burning desert skies. He was young again, 29 years old. Sweat soaked through his flight suit, while warning alarms echoed through the cargo aircraft around him. Smoke drifted through the cabin behind the cockpit door where terrified voices prayed in the darkness. 164 souls packed into a military transport already losing altitude over hostile territory. The instruments had failed then too. One engine choking on unstable pressure while panic spread faster than fire. Nathaniel could still feel the rough vibration in the flight controls beneath his hands. Could still hear the breathing of frightened men behind him. Altitude holding at 19,000. A younger co-pilot had shouted over the alarms. Not for long, Nathaniel had answered calmly. Always calm. Outside, the burning horizon had glowed orange beneath the night clouds, while tracer fire rose from the desert below, like sparks from hell itself. Then the memory shifted again. Static roaring through his headset. Sweat running into his eyes. One hand steady on the controls while the other reached toward the cracked radio panel. Raven 6 requesting emergency corridor. He had transmitted into the darkness. Silence had answered first. Then a voice filled with disbelief. Say again your call sign. The memory shattered apart beneath another violent tremor from Flight 482. Nathaniel opened his eyes slowly. Back inside the modern cockpit, Captain Mercer was staring at him now. Sir, Mercer asked carefully. Nathaniel looked toward the storm ahead of them. His voice came low and steady. You need to isolate the left transfer valve manually before the regulator loop cooks itself completely. Emily blinked. How do you know that? Nathaniel's gaze never left the windshield. Outside, thunder rolled across the black Atlantic sky. Because I have heard this aircraft dying before, he said quietly. For 3 long seconds, nobody inside the cockpit spoke. Rain exploded against the windshield while the aircraft groaned softly around them, like metal under strain. Captain Daniel Mercer stared at Nathaniel Reed with the same expression men wore when instinct began fighting logic. The old man beside him looked nothing like a pilot. Nothing like an engineer. Yet somehow he spoke about the failing aircraft with the calm precision of someone who had already survived this exact nightmare once before. First Officer Emily Carter finally broke the silence. Captain, if he is right about the transfer valve, and we keep letting the system autocorrect, we could overload the cooling loop. Mercer nodded slowly. He already knew that. The problem was that Nathaniel had reached the conclusion before the cockpit. Systems had. Nathaniel stepped closer to the overhead panel, careful and deliberate. He never touched anything without permission. Your environmental system is fighting itself, he said quietly. The aircraft keeps trying to compensate for pressure fluctuations that are feeding false clean data back into the computers. Emily shook her head slightly. That should not happen. Nathaniel glanced toward her. It should not, he agreed calmly. But it is. Another warning tone chirped sharply through the cockpit. This time a small amber caution light flickered beside the airflow monitoring display. Emily's face tightened instantly. Pressure differential just spiked again. Mercer reached for the controls. Manual isolation, he ordered. Emily obeyed immediately, fingers moving across the switches overhead. For several tense seconds, the cockpit filled only with the low hum of engines, static from radio traffic, and the endless drumming rain outside. Then the vibration changed. Subtly at first, the uneven pulsing beneath the aircraft softened. The whining harmonic hidden inside the airflow system faded slightly. Nathaniel heard it before anyone else did. His eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. There, he murmured. The aircraft can breathe again. Emily looked down at her instruments, disbelief slowly spreading across her face. Pressure stabilization is improving. Mercer stared at the displays for another second before exhaling hard through his nose. How the hell did you know that? Nathaniel did not answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the radio panel mounted between the pilots. The faint crackle of distant transmissions hissed softly through the cockpit speakers. Static. Frequency chatter. The sound seemed to pull him somewhere far away again. Claire Donovan stood silently near the cockpit doorway now, watching the old man with growing unease. The same passenger she had dismissed less than an hour ago was suddenly standing inside a modern commercial cockpit, helping experienced pilots stabilize a failing aircraft over the Atlantic Ocean. Nothing about this felt normal anymore. Mercer reached toward the communication panel. We still need priority. Routing, he muttered. If this system destabilizes again, I want immediate emergency clearance into the nearest military-capable runway. Nathaniel's gaze shifted toward the radio controls. Slowly, almost unconsciously, his weathered fingers brushed the edge of the panel. The movement froze halfway, like muscle memory waking from decades of silence. Then he spoke, quietly, calmly. Raven 6 requesting emergency corridor. The cockpit went still, completely still. Even the storm outside seemed distant for one impossible second. Emily Carter turned first. What did you just say? Nathaniel looked at the radio panel as though he had not realized he spoke aloud. Mercer frowned deeply. Raven 6. The old man's expression hardened slightly, not with fear, but with something older. Regret. Memory. Outside the cockpit, the transmission rolled invisibly through military and civilian frequencies scattered across the Atlantic corridor. Most ignored it. One did not. Hundreds of miles away, aboard a rotating Air Force E-3 Sentry orbiting above the eastern seaboard, a young surveillance officer suddenly looked up from his console. His fingers froze above the keyboard. "Control," he said slowly, uncertainty creeping into his voice. "Did Commercial Flight 482 just transmit the call sign Raven 6? Across the operations deck, conversation stopped. Inside the cockpit of Flight 482, the silence after the transmission felt heavier than the storm itself. Rain hammered across the windshield while static hissed softly through the radio speakers, but nobody moved for several seconds. Captain Daniel Mercer stared at Nathaniel Reed as though the old man had suddenly begun speaking another language. Emily Carter slowly removed her hand from the communication panel, her expression caught somewhere between confusion and disbelief. "What exactly is Raven 6? She asked quietly. Nathaniel looked toward the dark clouds ahead without answering. The faint glow from the instrument panels reflected across the deep lines in his face, carving old shadows beneath tired eyes that suddenly looked far older than 83. Then the radio crackled sharply. "Commercial Flight 482, this is Atlantic Control. Confirm previous transmission." Mercer immediately leaned toward the headset. "Atlantic Control, Flight 482 declaring systems emergency. Stand by for additional details." A pause followed. Then the controller's voice returned, different now, more careful. "Flight 482. Did your cockpit just transmit the call sign Raven 6? Mercer frowned. "Negative intentional transmission." Emily glanced sideways toward Nathaniel. "It was him," she whispered. Mercer muted the outgoing channel for a moment and turned fully toward the old man. "Sir," he said carefully, "I need to understand what that call sign means." Nathaniel's jaw tightened slightly. Not fear. Weariness. Like a door inside him had opened that he spent decades trying to keep closed. "It does not matter anymore," he answered quietly. Before Mercer could press further, another voice suddenly cut into the radio frequency. Calm. Military. Crisp with authority. "Flight 482. This is Overwatch Command requesting authentication of call sign transmission." Emily's eyes widened instantly. Civilian air traffic control did not sound like that. Mercer straightened in his seat. "Overwatch Command. This is Civilian Aircraft Flight 482. We are managing an onboard systems malfunction. Clarify your request." Static crackled. Then came the response. "Flight 482. Authenticate Raven 6 immediately." Claire Donovan felt the temperature in the cockpit drop despite the heated electronics around them. Even Mercer looked unsettled now. Nathaniel slowly stepped closer to the radio panel. His weathered fingers rested lightly against the edge of the console while the storm flashed white beyond the windshield. Somewhere far below, the Atlantic rolled unseen beneath layers of cloud and darkness. "This is unnecessary," Nathaniel murmured softly. The radio answered almost instantly. "Sir, if this is truly Raven 6, then command authority requires confirmation." Silence settled again. Nathaniel closed his eyes briefly. When he spoke, his voice changed. Still quiet. Still calm. But older somehow. Sharper. Like buried steel resurfacing after years beneath the earth. "Raven 6 authenticated," he said evenly. "Code Sierra. Echo 719. The effect was immediate. Static exploded across the channel as multiple frequencies suddenly came alive at once. Voices overlapped. Rapid military chatter flooded through the speakers before cutting out abruptly again. Then complete silence. Emily stared openly now. "Captain," Mercer did not answer her. His eyes remained locked on Nathaniel Reed. Outside the cockpit windows, lightning flashed again across the storm front ahead. For half a second, the old man's reflection stared back from the glass beside the instrument lights. Calm, motionless, like he had stood inside storms his entire life. Then a new voice filled the radio. Older, controlled, carrying the unmistakable weight of command. "Raven 6, the voice said slowly. "This is Eastern Defense Sector Command." "Sir, we thought you were gone." Nathaniel lowered his eyes toward the dark cockpit floor. His answer came barely above a whisper. "So did I." Across the cabin, Passengers still clutched armrests and whispered frightened prayers, unaware that somewhere above the Atlantic Ocean, military command channels across the eastern seaboard had just awakened for one old man sitting quietly inside a failing aircraft. The atmosphere inside Flight 482 changed long before the passengers understood why. Fear still lingered in the cabin like heavy smoke, but now something else moved beneath it. Confusion, unease, the strange instinct people feel when power shifts silently around them without explanation. Claire Donovan stepped back into the aisle from the cockpit, her face pale beneath the dim cabin lights. She looked at the frightened passengers differently now, not because the danger had disappeared, because she suddenly realized the quiet old man in seat 16 had never truly been one of them. Richard Cole noticed it immediately. "What is going on up there?" he demanded sharply. Claire opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time in 11 years of flying, she genuinely did not know what she was allowed to say. Behind the cockpit door, military frequencies still whispered through the radio speakers in clipped urgent bursts. Captain Daniel Mercer sat rigid in his seat, listening while Nathaniel Reed stood silently beside the center console, one hand resting lightly against the edge of the instrument panel. "Eastern Defense Sector confirms escort authorization," the radio voice announced. "Estimated intercept in 6 minutes." Emily Carter blinked hard. "Escort." Mercer looked toward the storm ahead. "They are scrambling fighters for us." Emily swallowed slowly. "For the aircraft?" The radio answered before Mercer could. "Negative. Escort package authorized specifically for Raven 6. Silence swallowed the cockpit again. Nathaniel lowered his eyes slightly, exhaustion flickering across his weathered face. "That is not necessary," he said quietly. The response came immediately. "Respectfully, sir, command disagrees." Outside, the storm clouds stretched endlessly across the night sky, black towers illuminated by distant lightning. Flight 482 continued cutting through the turbulence while the damaged pressure system groaned softly beneath the floor panels. Yet inside the cockpit, nobody looked at the failing aircraft anymore. They looked at Nathaniel Reed. Somewhere near the middle rows, a passenger suddenly pointed toward the window. "What is that?" Heads turned instantly. Through gaps in the storm clouds, 2 distant lights moved fast across the darkness. Too fast. They grew larger within seconds, slicing through the rain with impossible precision. Then the shapes emerged fully from the clouds. Sleek, gray silhouettes gliding alongside the commercial aircraft beneath flashing navigation lights. F-35 Lightning fighters. The cabin erupted into stunned voices all at once. Passengers pressed against windows. Several pulled out phones with shaking hands. Even Richard Cole fell silent, staring out at the fighter jets pacing the aircraft perfectly through the storm. Claire felt her breath catch in her throat. She had seen military escorts only once before after a presidential diversion flight. But this felt different. Personal. One of the fighter pilots rolled slightly closer to the left side of the aircraft. The angular canopy reflected flashes of lightning, while the jet held formation with impossible smoothness beside the struggling airliner. Then, the cockpit radio crackled again. "Calm. Professional. Young. Flight 482. This is Guardian 1 on your left wing." A brief pause followed. "It is an honor to fly with you tonight, sir." Nathaniel closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. Like the weight of 40 years suddenly pressed down across his shoulders all at once. Captain Mercer looked toward him carefully. "Who are you?" Nathaniel stared out at the fighter escort beyond the windshield. The reflection of the F-35 navigation lights shimmered faintly across his tired eyes. "Just a pilot," he answered softly. Mercer almost laughed at the absurdity of it, but the sound died before it left his throat. Nobody escorted commercial aircraft across the Atlantic for just a pilot. In the cabin, Claire slowly looked toward Richard Cole. The businessman avoided her eyes completely now. His earlier arrogance had vanished somewhere between the military transmissions and the appearance of armed fighter jets outside the windows. Near seat 16A, several frightened passengers stared at the empty spot where Nathaniel had been sitting earlier. The old worn leather bag remained beneath the seat untouched. Quiet. Forgotten looking. Like the man who carried it for decades while the world moved on without realizing who it had left behind. By the time Flight 482 descended beneath the storm layer, dawn had begun bleeding faint silver light across the eastern horizon. The Atlantic below looked cold and endless beneath scattered clouds, while the damaged aircraft pushed steadily toward the military runway, now cleared exclusively for its arrival. The turbulence had eased, but nobody on board truly relaxed. Too much had changed. Passengers sat in stunned silence, stealing nervous glances toward the cockpit as the two F-35 fighters continued pacing the aircraft on both sides like silent guardians cutting through the morning sky. Inside the cockpit, Captain Daniel Mercer monitored the stabilized systems carefully while Nathaniel Reed stood quietly behind the seats, one weathered hand resting against the wall beside him for balance. He looked tired now, not weak, just heavy with memory. Like every mile toward the runway carried him backward. Through decades he had tried to leave behind. Runway cleared, Emily Carter announced softly. Full military priority. Mercer nodded once, then looked toward Nathaniel again. Sir, there are people waiting for you down there. Nathaniel's eyes lowered slightly. I know. The runway finally appeared through the thinning rain ahead, long strips of wet pavement glowing beneath rows of approach lights. But it was everything surrounding the runway that changed the atmosphere inside the cockpit completely. Military vehicles lined both sides of the tarmac. Security teams, command transports, personnel standing motionless in the cold dawn wind. Claire Donovan saw it first from the cabin windows and stopped walking mid-aisle. Oh my God, she whispered under her breath. Passengers pressed against the glass again, confusion spreading through the cabin. Richard Cole stared speechless now as the aircraft descended lower over the runway threshold. The two F-35 fighters peeled away smoothly at the last second, banking upward into the brightening clouds with military precision before disappearing into the morning sky. Flight 482 touched down hard but stable. Tires screamed briefly against the wet runway before the aircraft settled into a long, controlled roll. A wave of relieved applause erupted through the cabin instantly. Some passengers cried openly. Others simply leaned back in exhausted silence. Nathaniel didn't either. He just looked out the window toward the waiting figures beside the runway. The aircraft slowed gradually before finally stopping near a secured military apron far from the civilian terminals. Outside, engines hummed softly in the cold morning air while rainwater shimmered beneath flashing emergency lights. Then the cabin door opened. Silence swept through the aircraft almost immediately. A tall Air Force general in a dark overcoat stepped aboard first. Four silver stars gleamed faintly beneath the cabin lights. General Adrian Walker. Behind him stood uniformed officers and security personnel, all perfectly still. Claire Donovan instinctively stepped aside as the general moved slowly down the aisle. Every passenger watched him. Nobody spoke. Walker stopped beside seat 16A, where Nathaniel's worn leather bag still rested beneath the chair. For one long second, the general simply looked at it. Then his eyes lifted toward Nathaniel Reed, standing quietly near the cockpit entrance. The old pilot looked smaller now somehow. Just an elderly black man in a gray coat after a long flight across the Atlantic. But the moment General Walker saw him, his posture changed completely. The four-star general came to full attention in the center of the silent cabin. Then he saluted. Sharp. Absolute. The kind of salute that carried history inside it. Welcome home, Raven 6, Walker said quietly. Nobody moved. Not the passengers. Not the crew. Not even Richard Cole, whose face had gone completely pale somewhere between the fighter escort and the salute now unfolding in front of him. Claire felt tears sting unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes. Nathaniel looked at the general for a long moment before slowly returning the salute with tired, steady fingers. It has been a long time, he said softly. Walker nodded once. Yes, sir, he answered. But not one day did we forget what you carried home for us. Nathaniel lowered his hand slowly. His eyes drifted toward the cabin windows where the storm clouds were finally breaking apart beyond the runway lights. Golden dawn spilled across the wet tarmac, while turbine engines hummed softly in the cold morning air. And for the first time since boarding the aircraft in Dallas, Nathaniel Reed allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile.